Welcome and thank you for joining us for this session. We're going to be speaking with Kenny Kong of Breathe Better Salt Rooms in Australia. Now, Kenny is a real mine of information. He's got a lot of experience, and what he doesn't know about salt often isn't worth knowing. So today we're going to be talking about the most common ailments that we might see coming into the salt rooms and how we can work with our clients to develop a way forward. A little bit like creating a treatment plan, but we're not there to diagnose, cure, advise them to go off any of their medication. And we also want to ensure that they're also talking with their physician or doctor and discussing this with them. So this plan is just a way forward to help them understand how many sessions might be required to achieve the best results based on the condition that they present with. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Kenny.
Thanks, Erin. Hi, everyone. How are you all?
Well, good, hopefully.
I'm expecting a round chorus. Yeah, we're great. We're great. We do salt therapy. We're fantastic.
Yeah. Good.
So, look, Erin asked me to sort of describe a few different ailments and what sort of treatment plan, how do we approach it. So some of them, the most obvious one that we come up with was asthma, which was on top of Erin's list and on top of my list as well. So I'm sure it's on top of everybody else's list as well. All right. Asthma is quite well known. Everyone knows that kids get diagnosed from an early age, from 3 years of age onwards. You can get adult onset asthma and so forth. And the typical way of treating asthma was through the use of, the most famous one is the reliever. Most famous of them was the Ventolin inhaler, simply a steroid delivered by orally to relieve inflammation. Sometimes chronic cases get prescribed preventer, which is designed to block the chemical hormones being sent to the bronchial area to inflame. Now, what we're going to talk about salt therapy can do for asthma. All right. Salt therapy is great in that what it does, we're clearly coming in with people who have already been diagnosed by their physicians, their GPs or their doctors or their lung specialists as an asthmatic. So what salt therapy does, we're not interested really in too much of the official diagnosis. We're interested in what sort of symptoms they're suffering. And the symptoms are quite typical: congestion buildup and production, and inflammation that's blocking their airflow. All right. And so what salt therapy does is, as you all know, when you're breathing in salt therapy, it's the micro climate of salt, where you breathe in minute particles of salt that measure about 0.2 to 0.5 of a micron in size. All that simply means is that as opposed to walking outside and walking into a dust storm, you end up choking and spluttering and coughing there because the dust particles are too large. In the salt rooms itself, the salt's ground down to a fine dust, so fine that it actually passes through your airways unimpeded. And the purpose of that is to get the salt down as far as possible down the airways, simply because the congestion and the inflammation buildup exists all the way down the primary bronchial, even down the secondary, even the tertiary branches of the lungs, and in some cases further down. But with asthma, it can be a sudden trigger of environmental or emotional issues. So other issues include allergies to dust, dust mites, allergies to pollen, ryegrass and all that sort of thing, allergies to chemicals that are emitted in the house, basic household cleaning, and asthma can be induced by exercise and infection, bacterial or viral. So this is where salt therapy's got a fantastic advantage, I believe, over many other forms of therapy or treatment plans. So the way salt therapy works is that when you breathe in the minute particles of salt, the salt will break up that congestion that's stuck. So typically in airways where there's congestion, and particularly those with the infection-based triggering of the asthma, the airways are inflamed at a constant at a constant, and there's increase in production of the congestion. So typically, a lot of times people have found that being asthmatic and being triggered by a bacterial or viral chest infection, when they take the Ventolin, they find, oh, it doesn't seem to really work. It's not working. They keep puffing away 6 or 7 puffs later on, then they do the asthma plan, sometimes it's 6 rapid puffs in a row. I think these days now in Australia, they're instructed for 20 puffs of Ventolin in a row, which is quite significant, because they want to overwhelm the area with Ventolin or the steroid. But the problem is that particularly with an infection-induced asthma attack, is that there's a congestion buildup that covers the inflamed walls where the steroid is supposed to land on and stimulate to open up. The problem is that it's covered and it's almost protecting it from the steroid. Now, what happens there is that the side effect of I'll go into the side effect next, but what happens is that nothing happens to the actual asthma attack itself. But the problem is that where most of it, I think they've rated about 80–85% of the Ventolin that gets puffed in hits the back of the throat, but it doesn't just go away or stay there. It actually gets absorbed by the bloodstream, and the result is an increase in heart rate, simply because you've got all this steroid pumping through the blood system, and as a result, you have increased blood pressure, increased heart rate. Usually, acceptable side effects are as a result of you getting relief from the Ventolin. But when you're usually exercise induced, or there's a huge congestion buildup, and that protects that membrane wall from the inhaler, that's not acceptable. You've got that increase in heart rate. So what the salt therapy does is actually it breaks up that congestion and allows it to be pushed up. So typically in inflamed airways, the little hair-like structures of cilia normally bring congestion up as part of the normal cleaning process of the airways. But the problem is that when it's inflamed, they're a little bit stuck like this, and they can't move as well. They're not moving in wavy ways, so they're not as efficient as normal in bringing congestion up, particularly in asthma attack. So what happens is that they get stuck, the congestion stays down there, and becomes sticky and harder the longer it stays. And when that occurs, that irritates the airways for another asthma attack as well, simply because you've got all that blockage, you're trying to cough it up, and that is also another trigger, that violent coughing, trying to get it out when you end up with a real sore throat here, but no congestion coming up, but really that induces another attack. So the salt breaks up that congestion and allows the little cilia to move that congestion out of the way. You cough it up. Some people swallow it back down, so it comes out the other end. But more importantly, it's out of the system and allows the salt to land on the membrane walls of the inflamed walls and start drawing out all that inflammation and eventually opening up the airways. In that process, it'll kill off or dehydrate first and kill off any bacteria and virus that's causing that initial infection. Any allergens that's present, it actually draws it all out, and you'll end up coughing it all out. It's a straightforward process, but it's a deliberate and time. What's the right words? It's based on a number of sessions over a period of time. So typically, we find kids get great results within a couple of months, give or take a couple of weeks, based on about 3 sessions a week. Each of my sessions here, I hold 45 minutes in length. So just to give you an idea, 3 times 45 minutes over a couple of months. For adults, usually a little bit more than 3 months. Again, based on 3 sessions a week. I always recommend 3 sessions a week as a base. And what that does, it draws out a lot of the allergens. So typically, if it's an allergen base, so if during allergy season, hay fever season, pollen, that triggers the asthma attack as well, which quite often is hand in hand. Quite often let's use pollen as an example. When you breathe in pollen and your body detects it after it explodes in your airways. When it makes contact with any moisture, it explodes, and your body detects it, so you have an automatic allergy response to it. You'll sneeze it out, blow it out, cough it out. But more importantly, when the pollen that you cough out is just the shell, the inert shell, and it's already made a deposit which is absorbed by the membrane walls particularly in the sinuses, but also in the upper trachea. And what that does is continually build up over time all all that allergen is absorbed into the membrane walls, making it far more sensitive to another asthma attack. If you're allergy based, you seem to be getting worse as the seasons go on. Not because you're getting older and slower, but simply because you picked up a lot of allergens along the way. But the good news is that salt therapy, in the course of breaking up congestion, drawing out that inflammation, along with the inflammation, it draws out all the deposits that's left behind in the sinus and the upper trachea, where it won't be able to do any more harm. That's why they say it's antihistamine, simply because it draws out all the allergens, which is histamine based. So, look, sometimes in a session, an asthmatic, especially in the early days, might feel overwhelmed. It's sometimes just emotional based, or it's physiological as well. When they're basically breathing in solid particles and to cough up, and that can itself induce another asthma attack as well. So you've got to keep the faith with the clients that are coming in, to reassure them that it is part of the process, and sometimes you may have an adverse reaction. Keep in mind that kids, you all know about kids who have asthma, who traditionally the Ventolin doesn't seem to work, or they don't know how to use the Ventolin. They get put on a nebulizer. It's basically a Ventolin mixed with a saline solution, which, by the way, has a heavier saline content than, say, the amount of salt that you breathe in a salt session. So, because the saline solution is designed to cut through all that greasy, sticky congestion to allow the Ventolin in there. So salt therapy is used by the medical profession as well. But
it's really interesting that, yeah. And I think one or a couple of important things to just quickly touch base on is, you mentioned about, you go out into a dust storm and the particles are a lot bigger, so that triggers a reaction, whereas the salt particles are very, very fine, which enables you to inhale them and go right down into the lungs. It's really important that I think there's a bit of miseducation actually over salt therapy, and a lot of people go into a salt room expecting to be able to see all these big billows of salt dust and everything, but it's not true. You don't need to be seeing all these big particles of salt floating around, and that's why Kenny mentioned between 0.2 and 0.5 microns in size is super fine. You can't actually see that with the naked eye, and those particles are the ones that are going to migrate all the way down into the airways and have the greatest effect. And I get that a lot. I hear people saying, well, I can't see the salt, and you can shine a torch on it, and in the right light you can see it, and you can show that to them. But just be careful that you're not just creating larger particles just so people can see them. That's
right. So the key element is 0.2 to 0.5 micron. I think that's like, what's that compared to a size of the breadth of a hair?
Well, a hair is between 50 and 100 microns in size. So it's super tiny. Yeah. So you're actually getting down closer to the sizes that smoke particles are when you're getting into those diameters.
Having large particles is no good, because, look, large particles will only get down so far down the airways. But the smaller particle, the further down the airways it goes, and you want it down as far as you can. Exactly. Particularly for infants, which we'll discuss a little bit later on about salt therapy and babies and infants. But the smaller particle, the further down it goes. And obviously, when salt therapy originated in the salt mines, you didn't have billows of it looked like billows of smoke or fog in the salt mines. It was actually, it looked like a clean atmosphere.
Exactly. Yeah. And then when you compare it to you can also get wet salt therapy, or as you talk about, the nebulizers. But what happens is that when you attach moisture to salt, it actually increases in size. So again, they're not going to be as effective as dry salt therapy.
Yeah, on that note, even further. So look, a lot of people in the old days, everyone's grandparents probably told them that they used to get, as kids, they grew up, if they felt sick or something, they get sent down to the seaside to get better. That's actually salt therapy, but it's high salt content in the air, but it's a wet salt. So what we're doing with halotherapy is that we're actually extracting moisture out of the airways. So I never really subscribed to all those misters and all that sort of thing that produce a saline mist. They're still putting moisture in there, and our job is to get the moisture out to clear the airways. I can't emphasize that any as that. I think in the early days, I used to sell this little thing called a Halopod, and it produced this salty mist. But it was everything around it was slippery, and I didn't realise how. I'm going to stop. I think I was one of the first salt centers to stop selling that. Just to refuse to sell that anymore, simply because you're putting moisture in your airways, which is the complete opposite of what we're doing here.
Exactly. And the other point to note, when you attach moisture to salt, it becomes corrosive. So surfaces around you, things like that, they're going to corrode a lot quicker if you've got moisture attached to it. But let's get back on track, Kenny. So we're talking asthma. You mentioned children. So developing a plan, we're talking around 3 sessions a week. That's the kind of thing I suggest to people as well. You're looking at a long period of time, 2-3 months, to really get on top of things. And I think what we're trying to do is actually to clear out those airways and get right back to nice clean airways so that they can function better and deal with these allergens in a much more efficient way, which in turn then reduces the response to these allergies and stops the extent of the production of the mucus and the buildup in the airways. What I see with a lot of my clients, and also myself, because I suffered from asthma, was that once I'd done that intense course and basically stripped everything back, got right back to the clean airways, I was able to reduce right back down to once a week, once a fortnight, stay on top of things. And then potentially when allergy season would come along, I'd then kind of do another course in advance of it to try and bolster my system again.
Yeah, so it's a good one. So one of the things I've been explaining to people is about their immune system.
Oh no, he's frozen. It must be the long distance between here and Australia. Hopefully he's going to jump back in a second.
So typically their immune system's shot as it is, and so they're allowing, so basic infections and allergens are triggering the asthma attack with great ease. So when I talk with salt therapy, I feel it can be a long-term plan. So when people are doing salt therapy, so for kids, usually they can get over most, if not all, of the symptoms. They're still an asthmatic. They're not cured. I've got to stress that. But what it does is it significantly reduces the number of attacks they have, and each attack is significantly reduced in severity. So, and that's as close as you can get without being a cure. So I use myself as an example. I'm a lifelong asthmatic. I'm 54 years of age. Up until I did salt therapy as a customer 9 years ago, actually it might be getting close to 10 years, 9.5 years ago, I was averaging about 20 puffs of Ventolin a day.
Wow.
Right? Yeah. And I was on a preventer, the Serotype Accu 500. I was on that morning and night, and I'm still getting attacks, right? And it didn't help. My lifestyle was shift work, so I wasn't getting much sleep. So therefore, my immune system was shot, right? And I was just barely hanging on. This was just keeping me functioning, right? But after doing salt therapy, my year-long cough, which I hadn't really realised it was a cough, or that it was loud, or that my kids used to locate me in the shopping centre for my cough. And my constant bronchitis, that was gone. My asthma is now, well, it's hard to say now, but I will say now is that I'm using my Ventolin probably a couple of times every 2 or 3 weeks, and I'm off the preventer. The doc said, "Gee, you don't even need this."
Yeah,
so I said, "No, don't worry about it."
Yeah, that's important too. We're not telling people out there to stop their medication, and we're definitely encouraging you to continue to talk to your physician as well, and make sure that you go to those regular checkups. So do not tell your clients to stop their medication. Do make sure that they keep their physician informed of their progress. And with their regular asthma checks, I know I still get called for mine, and whenever I go, they're like, "Well, you're managing it yourself now, it's brilliant." They need to keep going to those, because that's how their medication gets assessed. It's not by us. We do not interfere with their medication. So please make sure that you understand that. We're not replacing things. But as Kenny says, that the more that you or they are using salt therapy, the less asthma attacks they're getting, the less that they're actually ending up having to use their medication. So that's a really real positive win from that side of things.
I might also add, as far as medication is concerned, the salt therapy actually makes the Ventolin a far more effective inhaler, simply because, as I mentioned, as an example with infection-based or even allergy-based attacks, there's a congestion cover over the inflamed airway. So what it does, the salt cuts through that and allows the Ventolin to be far more effective. Well, and any oral reliever, any oral preventer will be far more effective than before. So we're actually enabling that to be used in the most correct and possible way, if anything.
Absolutely. Now, moving from asthma, a lot of those people that suffer from asthma, like myself, also suffer from eczema. The two seem to go hand in hand very nicely. So how about we move on to eczema next?
Absolutely. Eczema is a bit of a funny one. It's judged by people's sight of the condition and symptom, more likely the symptom. So it's typically signified by the red blotches on the skin. Sometimes there's a white scaling, and sometimes it's an open wound bleeding. Quite often it can be a result of its own infection bubbling over so rapidly that it splits the skin, but other times can be as a result of unconscious acts of scratching whilst you're asleep. So salt therapy is extremely effective for eczema, but the problem is that it looks like it makes it worse in that trial. So again, it's the same with asthma. The time length, I find that kids take a couple of months, give or take a couple of weeks, to actually get to the point where the eczema symptoms are gone. Now, again, it's just symptoms. They've still got the little bit in their body that says that they are still prone to eczema, dependent on the situation. All right. So what salt therapy does is simply reduces those symptoms, those red blotches, the bleeding, and the crusty skin, reduces it and enables the body to resist eczema attacks when the worst time of year or worst environment happens to them. All right. So the way it does it, salt therapy works in two ways. The first one is the obvious one, where the minute salt particles. Again, the finer the particle, the better. You don't want people caking on soap by themselves, because that's not effective. Because the salt that you see is not the salt that you want on your skin. The salt that you want is the one that you can't see, because you're a big person. Your pores are tiny. You want the minute particles to get into the pores, and the action of the salt is subtle. It'll draw that inflammation out. Now, as you know, the skin's in layers, multiple layers. So what we see on the top, let's say bird's eye view, is of that eczema. It doesn't just sit on the top layer. It actually runs right deep down. So the salt from the top will draw it through the layers. So the direct effect is that it looks like it's getting worse. So there's a bit of a saying that we like to say is that it's got to get redder before it gets better. If you can remember that, then you can at least reassure your clients. And reassure is another key word. You need to reassure your clients quite regularly. And I found that usually the guys in the mid-20s range that need regular reassurances, because it can impact their self-esteem, how their friends and family see them. And the difficulty one is that they need their family and their friends' support, because quite often they can make not necessarily disparaging comments, but rather comments that aren't really supportive. So, look, you've got to stop this. This is not working. You look terrible. But that process, they've got to get there. So it actually draws all that inflammation out through the layers and up the surface. That's where it's all gathering. And looks for in some cases, bad cases, you might get some slight pus on each of the extra spots. So it's always great to have a salt bath at the end of the day after you've done salt therapy, just to wash off those toxins and continue the slight drawing out process, because there's a salty water you've had a bath in. But
so one question about the bath, Kenny, just how much salt are you suggesting putting in that bath? Because we don't want them to scream as they get in.
Yeah, that's one of those piece of string questions, Erin. Look, I've always recommended starting off slow, like a cup in a bath. You're hardly going to feel anything, and eventually just work your way out to where you're tolerating it. If particularly for those who don't have any actual open wounds, the ones with open wounds, be careful. It's going to hurt. It's salt on a wound. Remember the saying. Right? So if their skin hasn't split, there's no bleeding, go for it. You can keep putting a lot of salt in and drawing out the salt process, right? But again, you have to watch your response.
And what salt are you using, Kenny?
I'm using pharmaceutical grade sea salt. It's the only one anyone should use. I don't ever recommend using Himalayan salt because Himalayan salt is not pure. It's really crystalline. It's basically you're basically making salt straight out of the sea, right? It's crystallized. It's got a lot of biomass in it, right? Use pharmaceutical grade sea salt, and for those operating salt centers, it's really the byproduct from the salt room, from the halo generator that you've gathered underneath the machine, and repackage that. That's another business direction.
I do that.
And sell it off.
Exactly.
It's no cost. The cost, you've already built the cost into the actual halotherapy itself. Now bath time is let's get rid of this excess excess byproduct for good reason and for a bit of a profit. Very
Okay, so they're going to do some bathing as well.
The salt, but importantly, the salt. Well, it's a very deliberate process. Again, I always recommend 3 sessions a week at least. I like to see people come in 4 times a week. It draws it out over time, and what it does, it'll bring it all out. And the time when it actually becomes better, looks healed, is actually days after the worst it's ever been and worst you've ever seen. Right? It sort of reaches that hill, and when it reaches that peak, bang! All of a sudden it starts shrinking in size. The red becomes pink, and all of a sudden it's like it was never there. But it takes time and it takes commitment to the salt rooms.
Yeah. Another thing that's worth talking to the clients who are coming in with the eczema as well is about their diet and other things as well, because there are a lot of other triggers out there that no matter how much salt therapy we do, if they're going to keep putting certain things into their body to create this reaction, we're not going to have the results either.
Yeah, it's a real difficult one. So it's difficult for people who are ingrained in what they eat. So look, I've got clients who are regular visitors to McDonald's, drink Coca-Cola every day by the litres, and they smoke as well. So, and they're trying to fix their eczema. I reckon they would have fixed their eczema without all that stuff, and they don't need salt therapy. But look, salt therapy is, it has greater efficacy if you're on a very balanced diet of no inflammatory foods. So that means get rid of the sugar. I don't want to say get rid of coffee because I love coffee.
In moderation, everything in moderation, Kenny.
It is moderation, and you certainly can drink 1 cup a day. But try to include fresh vegetables. Fresh vegetables are a natural anti-inflammatory as well as antioxidant amongst the rest of the benefits. But in particular for eczema, you need foods that are anti-inflammatory, and eating a high protein diet is just going to encourage that eczema, and high sugar as well.
Absolutely. Now, if you haven't seen Connie and G's discussion that we've had, Connie does talk a lot about inflammation and again about the eczema triggers. So hop over and have a look at that discussion. But from personal experience, I know that things like tomatoes, citrus fruits, chocolate were some of my biggest triggers. I know. But it's, everyone's different as well. So it's just about getting them to explore what it might be triggering it. And you know, I've been seeing a little boy, and we had this long discussion about what they were eating. And the mother said to me, oh yeah, he has loads of tomatoes. He loves tomatoes every single day. And I'm like, whoa, no, stop the tomatoes. Yeah, exactly. So, you know, there's certain things there that you can look at. Oops, a daisy there. We left off with Kenny waving his red flag. That's the joy of trying to connect with someone down under, as the connection isn't always stable. But we're back again, so we're just going to finish off with eczema. We were just talking about a little boy who I'd been seeing, and talking about his allergies. But I have a couple of little pictures I thought I might just share with you. These are some of the images here. So you can see before he came to halotherapy, this was a very unhappy little boy. His mum was very distressed. The little boy was angry. She basically tried everything. Nothing had worked. And then she heard about halotherapy. We talked about a kind of a treatment plan for her, or a regime, and she committed to 3 to 4 times a week. There was 1 week of no sessions, but after 29 sessions, look where this little boy's skin is at. It's just phenomenal. The joy on both the little boy's face and the mum is just unreal. They've never felt a skin like this before. And, you know, this is why we do what we do, isn't it? You know, when we can see such a change in somebody's life and make such a difference, there really are no words. We're still going to be entering into a maintenance phase for this little lad. And we're going to continue with 2 sessions a week for a few more weeks. And then we're going to move on to once a week. And this is where it's really important that you keep talking with your client, isn't it, Kenny? You know, to work out what works for them, because everyone's going to react different.
Yeah, one of the things is with eczema, particularly eczema for little kids, is the constant counselling and the reassurance that you need to provide for the parents, and keep them abreast of every aspect of the development of the eczema, and how the salt therapy draws that inflammation out. And there might be some days where it suddenly clears up quickly and then comes back again, and that's just simply as the inflammation gets drawn through the skin layers and eventually gets drawn out. So it'll reach a point where it actually looks like it's the worst possible scene on the skin ever they've seen from eczema, the worst it's ever been. It's simply because it's getting drawn out to the surface of the skin from deep down below. And it'll be almost like, for kids, we find usually around the 9, 10 or 11 week mark, depending on how deep it is, that's where it suddenly gets extremely red and extremely all over, and suddenly, almost like a click of a switch, it disappears and drops off, simply because it's been drawn out. And it's great because, and in addition to the salt therapy drawing that out, what's happened is that the little kids who are particularly little kids, they're breathing the salt particles and cleaning out their airways and increasing their oxygen saturation in their blood, which feeds their organs and their skin in particular, and reduces blood pressure and improves their own immune system, so that moving forward, that their immune system can take on what originally should be. It can take on any potential flare-ups from a change of environment, change of weather, or a change of diet or anything like that. So the immune system is what controls it. And by coming in after that initial therapy of 3 or 4 sessions a week for that 2 or so month period, where you're doing 1 or 2 sessions a week to maintain that balance, to maintain the immune system's strength and the skin's cleanliness.
Yeah, it just shows how things are really all connected, doesn't it?
Very much so.
Yeah, so moving on from eczema, another thing that is very similar and can often be confused with eczema is psoriasis. It is another dry skin condition. So let's just talk really briefly on this one.
So psoriasis, look, it's the same process from our perspective as salt therapy centres. We don't really necessarily look at the conditions and diagnose the actual conditions. They present to us with a pre-diagnosed from their specialists, their GPs and so forth. And the result of that is that they may be diagnosed with psoriasis, eczema, any sort of dermatitis, but the result is inflammation of the skin, and the redness, which is quite pronounced, is what we deal with. The salt will simply draw that through the skin layers. It's nothing to be fearful of for any of the salt therapists that's working in the salt rooms. We're just dealing with the inflammation of the skin, which in any sort of dermatitis, eczema, and psoriasis, we can just put them pretty much in the one basket, where the salt draws all that inflammation through the skin layers. The result is that the inflammation rises through the skin layers and to the surface. And an old saying we like to say is it's got to get redder before it gets better, and it'll go through that process again and again during that process, but particularly for kids, it takes a couple of months, give or take a few weeks, and their immune system gets strengthened in the same process. So really, it doesn't matter what sort of skin condition, really. We're not here to be the doctors or specialists of skin. We're here to treat provide therapy for the inflammation of the skin. And salt, as it always has been doing, absorbs moisture and it draws it through the skin layers. And again, the finer the particles, the better the results. So don't be looking for big clouds of salt. Don't be grabbing salt from someplace and rubbing it in your skin, because that's not how it works. It's a combined therapy of the finest particles, like 0.2 micron in size, which gets into the pores and draws the inflammation out, and also the combination of breathing and salt particles to improve not only just lung health, but your overall your immune system to improve, which ultimately controls your skin's response down the track once we've given you the helping hand it needed.
And then once all that inflammation is drawn out, the other thing that the salt can then start doing is actually drawing moisture back onto the skin, which then helps to soften the skin as well. So it all kind of works together. It's all very much connected. And as Kenny says,
it's a funny thing with the skin getting moisturized, because while it's drawing out the inflammation, behind that inflammation is drawing the natural hydration through the skin layers. So it's ironically, the salt is dry and it goes on the skin. It's actually far more moisturizing, where it draws the natural hydration of the skin through the skin layers. It's better than coconut oil, better than any moisturizer, better than any $100 per 100 ml moisturizer that you'll pay. Salt's so effective in moisturizing the skin. It comes out softer and more supple.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely brilliant. Right. So let's move on from skin conditions onto other childhood conditions that we might see coming into our salt centres.
Yeah, look, cold and flu, kids touch everything. They're not. There's no special barriers. They get up close to other kids. They touch things. They might be slobbering. One kid might be dribbling, but it doesn't matter to all the kids around them. They'll be touching them anyway. And so they pass various viral infections and bacterial infections quite easily between themselves. So particularly daycares and schools and kindergartens. So what happens there is that depending on how it infects them, quite often it can be a viral or a bacterial infection through the sinus. And let's say, for example, there's either sinus infection or a chest infection. So sinus infection can get quite serious and leads directly to the ear. So the sinus tube actually leads directly to the eustachian tube, which leads directly into behind the eardrum. But that eustachian tube is slightly larger than the sinus tubes, and just before that connection, there's almost like a little well that's like a circuit breaker for any infections potentially to get in. Makes it more difficult to get into the ear. But the problem is that once it gets in there after prolonged sinus infections, we find that ear infections take hold and are quite difficult to remove. But the good news is that salt therapy is fantastic for that, because one, it starts digging away, chipping away at the sinus right from the beginning from the nostrils in through the sinuses, and chipping away, drawing out and breaking up congestion, drawing out that inflammation, and in the process, dehydrating and killing off bacteria and virus that's in there. And eventually, it usually takes somewhere between 6 to 9 weeks, what we found based on 3 sessions a week with kids who've got ear infection, which causes them to have grommets installed, or they've got a loss of hearing. It actually dries it out from inside, and it's quite effective in doing that. And we found that, in particular, one girl, she'd been doing salt. In fact, the mother thought that the girl was actually deaf.
Wow.
And but she had a sinus infection. They didn't want to put the grommets in until her sinus had cleared. So they came into the salt rooms thinking, oh, well, we got an appointment in about a month's time to have these grommets installed to drain her ears. And she's deaf. They dealt with it already. And next thing you know, they do salt therapy. They're doing it probably about 3 or 4 times a week. And after about 5 weeks, they've got their appointment with the ENT guy, who looks into the ear and says, I don't need to put grommets in there. It's completely dry. There's no infection. There's no water in there. And so the mother said, well, but she's deaf. She shouldn't be. And then she turned around to her daughter, who's quite a very quiet nature. She said, no, I'm not deaf. I can hear everything you're saying. Oh, so they came back and said, I don't believe it. So when a caveat there, we're not a cure for deafness, okay? So that's one of the things. It chips away, it dries out the sinus, which connects directly into behind the eardrum, dries it all out and kills off infections. Now, for a child who's got an ear infection, it means they've had an ongoing sinus infection for many, many months, because it takes some time to actually get up there. It's quite difficult. Now, further down, in case the infection goes back down through back trip or through infection through the mouth and in the airways, it can infection down that way can actually lead to croup, which is primarily a viral infection, and that can accelerate quite quickly. And left unchecked, you've got that barking cough, where it's quite familiar, where kids just constantly barking. It's almost like a whooping cough. It's almost very difficult to differentiate. Once again, we're not here to diagnose those conditions. We see and hear the cough, and the salt therapy will provide relief by drawing out that inflammation and opening up the airways and killing off the infection. Now, on the off chance that they've left it too long, sometimes the infection gets down to become bronchitis, but in little kids under 2 especially, if it's a viral infection like an RSV, it can actually accelerate quite quickly through the primary bronchi and into the secondary bronchi and into the tertiary branches, and straight into the bronchioles, and causing a diagnosis of bronchiolitis, which is really the blockage of the tubes leading up to the air sacs, which always results in hospitalization, because they've got severe lack of oxygen, which drops to the low 90s or even down to the high 80s, which is quite dangerous. So in my honest opinion, salt therapy is just about the only thing that can actually fix the resulting problems caused by bronchiolitis, simply because if a child gets admitted to hospital, they'll administer oxygen and monitor their oxygen levels. And as soon as the oxygen levels are increased up to, past 95, 96, then they're deemed acceptable to go home. But all they're doing is saturating the healthy air sacs with high concentrations of oxygen until their overall oxygen count is up, which is great, because that's an emergency. But what salt therapy does after they've been to hospital is that it'll break up all that congestion, all that blockage. That inflammation is just simply blockage to the breath going through into the air sacs. So it clears it up and improves the efficiency of the air sacs, and therefore long term it'll clear out all the infection, which is typically a viral infection. And it's as simple as that. It's the easiest therapy to do, so long as you can come in 3 or 4 times a week over the course of anywhere between 8 and 10 weeks.
Yeah, and I guess it's also true that prevention's better than cure. But if you have got something, the sooner you can start the salt treatment, the quicker or the better chance you have of getting hold of it earlier and stopping it from deteriorating into something worse.
100%, 100%. Unfortunately, the problem is, and this is part of our jobs as salt therapists or salt therapy centres, we need to educate the public about the benefits of salt therapy and how we can prevent, we can manage, and we can get rid of the symptoms. All right, and reduce the chances of those sort of infections occurring.
Yeah, and there's nothing more heartbreaking or distressing than parents with children that are really struggling to breathe. I mean, that's a really scary thing to go through. No one wants to go through it. So if you have got people out there, remember that they are going to be needing a bit of support, as Kenny's already mentioned. And the
key thing is that typically bronchiolitis and all these sort of infections, they're occurring to kids that are under 2 years of age, and these are new parents. Babies don't come with manuals. We have no idea as parents when we first have kids, and also it is the most heartbreaking thing and scary to suddenly see your own child struggling for breath and coughing and spluttering, and there's not much they can do. The doctors are reluctant to administer, and rightly so, to administer steroids or any sort of medication because of their age and size. Yeah. So salt therapy is the most wonderful thing for babies. And the good news is that they have a very quicker response than an old fogey like me.
Well, you're not old, Kenny, but talking about older or more mature people, let's move on to...
That was a convenient lead-in.
It was, wasn't it? Let's talk about some of the conditions we might see the older generations coming in with to our salt rooms.
One of the things I found in that age group, all right, so I'm 54, so let's say people in their plus 65 age group, don't forget, they all grew, people in that age group were growing up in a culture where it was acceptable, more than acceptable, to have a cigarette in their hand and to smoke. And a lot of those smoking policies have only come in the late 90s, started coming in the late 90s. So everyone's had a lifetime of smoking in that age range, and because it was deemed not only acceptable, but a part of their own, I don't know, society's expectations. Ladies should have a cigarette in their hand. Men, it was quite macho to have a cigarette in their hand. So some of the problems that have come from there are emphysema and COPD, where their airways are completely... COPD, chronic pulmonary obstructive disease, is simply another term. Like, it's the best way to describe it is almost like a permanent asthma attack. But the problem is that the airways are so scarred that the inflammation is just so pronounced. And the emphysema is basically the destruction or deflation of their air sacs, simply because of all the toxic smoke that they've taken in over the years. And what salt therapy does, so when people have those sort of conditions, they find that their airways are permanently inflamed. They've got a lot of congestion that's built up over time, and the little cilia, little hair-like structures in there along all their bronchi, secondary bronchi, the tracheas, and all the bronchioles, a lot of them have stopped working because of all the smoke. They're designed to move in wave-like motions to bring congestion up to the surface as part of the normal cleaning process. But with the damage from the smoke and the scarring and the inflammation, a lot of them are killed off or rubbed off. So what salt therapy can do is actually aid the function of those little villi or cilia, because they're not as effective in moving congestion out. So people find that they're getting fuller and fuller of all this congestion in their airways, of this stickier and harder congestion. And they're not really colours of the rainbow. They'll be like your blacks and browns in there, but they can't come out because it's all stuck down there. So salt therapy, when you breathe in the particles, it'll actually break off that congestion and make it a little bit easier for what little cilia is left behind to bring up, and eventually they'll bring it up. Over time, all that congestion will be able to be removed, but it's a very slow process. It takes, look, for someone who's been smoking for, let's say, several decades, they've got a lot of tar in there and a lot of sticky congestion. You know, like I said, they're not colours of the rainbow. it usually takes about 3 months of regular salt therapy to start flushing it out. And I said, start flushing out that congestion. It's going to take a lot longer to break up more and more of that congestion. Eventually, once that congestion clears out of the way, the salt can actually land on the inflamed walls of the membrane walls of the primary bronchus and all the rest of the airways, and draw out all that inflammation. Now, it's not so much the scarring that's actually going to, that is making that kills people. Is actually the inflammation that's surrounded. So when there's scarring in the airways, you'll get inflammation around it, but inflammation that stays there too long, that's unabated, becomes scar tissue itself, because it stretches, and that becomes scar, and that scar tissue becomes bigger because it'll have inflammation around it, and that bigger inflammation will develop into stretch marks and stretching of the membrane wall, which turns into scarring, which in turn, because of scarring, turns into inflammation. Eventually they can't breathe. So the salt therapy draws out the inflammation. Again, it's not a cure for emphysema, it's not a cure for COPD, but it'll help manage your condition. It'll draw out the inflammation so you can breathe a little bit easier. It can probably improve, it'll most likely improve your lung function tests. A lot of people with these sort of lung problems that discover it now, and usually they're slower to act on it, and they're usually sitting on about 30% lung capacity by the time they actually finally do anything about it and see a lung specialist, get a lung function test and think, oh, well, this is disastrous. But it's not so much disastrous. So salt therapy can actually draw out that inflammation, because a lot of that inflammation has reduced that lung capacity. So I know that from past clients, their lung functions actually improve simply because of doing salt therapy. But again, it takes time and commitment, because people who've been smoking for decades and resulting with emphysema or COPD, it takes over 3 months of regular salt therapy to do.
It's really interesting that, and how it's connected as well. But not everyone who has COPD has obviously smoked. There are other people out there who haven't smoked and still end up with it, which is unfortunate. But also combining this with some good breath work is really important as well. That can really help improve the results that you get through the halotherapy. And if you want to find out more about some breathing techniques, there are some talks there by Patrick McCowan, Sandy Abrams, both very much experts in that area. So do check out our discussions with them. So breathing, another thing we do when we sleep is we breathe, but a lot of people often snore. So I do know that halotherapy can help people with their snoring. So let's talk quickly about that one too.
Well, snorers don't know they snore. They're in denial, probably. Look, for want of a better analogy, our airways have got pipes. It should be smooth and in fairly straight lines, okay? But every now and again, through infection, irritation, infection, bacterial or viral, irritation can be a result of a smoke. It can be a result of ciliosis, where they breathed in silica particles as a result of concrete or rock work, or glass, and any sort of foreign fragments that's caused an interruption. So when airways are irritated, they form inflammation around that point where there's an irritation. And quite often you have a straight pipe, straight line, and then all of a sudden you've got this fleshy, inflamed area with congestion around it. So doesn't have bone or anything like that. It's not hard. It's actually quite soft and flabby. So as the air passes through rapidly, it should be smooth pipes, but as it passes through, it suddenly narrows down into this flabby bit, and you get that sort of sound simply because it vibrates away and it's trying to get through. What salt therapy can do is again, I can't say it's a cure for snoring, but most snoring is caused by that irritation in the airways where there's inflammation. So salt will break up that congestion around that irritation, then draw out the inflammation and help move on that foreign particle or infection that's there. The infection will get killed off, or a foreign particle will help get moved out of the way along with the cilia.
I mean, the other thing that that the salt therapy can help is that a lot of snorers are often mouth breathers, And the reason that they're breathing through their mouth is because their sinus passages may be blocked. So if you can help remove the inflammation or the mucus buildup within the sinuses and clear those, there's a greater chance to start breathing through the nose. And if you want to find out more about how to change from a mouth breather to a nose breather, do check out Patrick McCohen's talk as well. Because
it's just such a funny term, mouth breather. It's like a derogatory term.
well, when you listen to Patrick's talk, actually, we shouldn't be breathing through our mouths. It's really important to be breathing through our nose, and our nose is the first line of defense as well.
Yeah.
So with all the little hairs in the nose, it is helping to remove a lot of those foreign allergens and things like that can trigger all these other responses.
That's right.
So we've talked about a lot today, which is amazing, and I could talk to you all day, Kenny, but I think let's just wrap up with something about how we've been treating or helping people with post-COVID, how to help them recover. And I guess it's not just post-COVID, it's really post any kind of infection, and helping them with that recovery process and getting back to their normal daily activities.
Yeah, it's post-COVID's an interesting one, because what we found was it affected different people differently. And so we've had people who were in their early 30s. They went running several kilometers 2 or 3 times a week. That would be the epitome of anyone's description of being fit, healthy young people. And several of those have come through here. They caught COVID months and months ago, and now they can barely walk. My centre sits on a slight incline, and and people have parked their cars probably about 5 shops away, and it's only a slight incline, probably about 5 degrees, right? And they come in completely puffed out, exhausted, and they say, "Oh, this has been this way ever since they had COVID." And what we find is that there's not necessarily a real correlation between someone's actual fitness and someone's actual overall respiratory health, because you can still have great fitness but no respiratory health, and all of a sudden that impacts that seemingly fit person. So what we found is it's all to do with the person's level of immune system. And what we find is that, yes, COVID, despite whatever news articles or whatever conspiracy theories, it's still a new virus at the end of the day. And what it did was it impacts someone's immune system, and their immune system may have been teetering, may have been close on the precipice of failing anyway. But your bodies everyone has their bodies that have become quite good at controlling, at keeping them in working function, is probably the best way of saying it. So if you're feeling a little bit down and you're probably on the verge of getting sick, you go to bed early and you say, "Oh, looks like I'm not clubbing tonight." But that's the body's way of sort of saying, look, you're almost about to, your immune system's about to spill over. So you just pull back a bit. And that's what they're, but getting a new viral infection like COVID, it sort of gives the immune system a right old whack, and all of a sudden the immune system's basically failing. So, and it happens that people, regardless of fitness, it's to do with their immune system's health. And especially with people who've got pre-existing conditions like diabetes or a heart condition or COPD, all those respiratory diseases, and all of a sudden they cop it badly. So all it is, it's an infection. As far as we're concerned, in the airways, we're not going to worry about what else COVID's supposed to do in the bloodstream or the organs. All we worry about is in the airways. So in the airways, it's a viral infection. It causes inflammation. It causes a reaction in there. There's congestion. So salt therapy, again, breaks up that congestion around that infected area and draws out the infection. And during the process, it actually helps rebuild or reset the immune system. So while they're doing salt therapy on a regular basis, and salt's actually killing off bacteria and viruses in the airways, your immune system spends a lot of energy in that area defending every breath you take. And so whilst it doesn't have to do that while you're doing salt therapy, well, the immune system can think, well, sometimes I think of the immune system like a third person. So the immune system can actually reset and rebuild and actually deal with other issues around the body, or just simply get better. And so by the time they finish doing salt therapy, after a period of time, and I can give you some numbers about what to expect, how long, in a second. Their immune system is what controls them when they leave the centre. And again, we're not diagnosing what their conditions are as a result of COVID. We're simply dealing with the symptoms that COVID's left them with. That's inflammation and congestion, and just focus on that. So what we found with COVID was that people who were supposedly young and fit and healthy and had no previous respiratory health, when they did salt therapy for somewhere between 3, 4, and 5 weeks, they averaged 3 or 4 sessions a week. We found that it got them back to square one, back to being before they got this COVID, and they were feeling better again. They were back to running. That's for people who are quite fit and quite young. People who know respiratory health or no respiratory issues in the past, and suddenly have asthma-like symptoms and a lot of congestion. They feel like their airways are quite heavy, very symptomatic of pneumonia, and they've been tolerating this for about 6 months. I'm getting people in who've had it for 6, 7 months. What we found that those people with no history of respiratory illness, they recovered probably around about 5, 6, 7 weeks, based on 3 or 4 sessions a week. And then we find, well, people who've got a history of respiratory illnesses like asthma, as an instance, they take about 6 weeks to get back to where they were before it, but they still have got asthma, okay? And they still need to do salt therapy for their asthma as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's very similar to what I've been seeing. And it's funny you mentioned like a little incline, because I've also got a little incline for people coming to the salt room. And it's actually quite a good measure for people, because I see them that they come in the first few times and they're really struggling to breathe, some of them. And then after a few more sessions, they make it all the way to the door without having to stop, and they're not quite so breathless. And I point it out to them, I'm like, you're right, actually, yeah. And it's these small little things that maybe they haven't noticed, but it is actually having this gradual effect. And I think that's another thing to be really mindful of, is that it's not a one-hit wonder. It's not going to cure, it's not going to remove your symptoms overnight. It does really take commitment, and the best results we do see are from those people who do commit to 3 to 4 sessions a week for a set number of weeks.
Yeah, 100%. A lot of people, we have to be aware that a lot of people are looking to improve. They're not looking for specific numbers, what their lung capacity is and what percentages are. They're looking for what they used to be able to do, what they can do now, what they can't do, and what can they do after they've done salt therapy. And it's a pretty easy equation, really. They want to get back to where they were before. Yeah,
I mean, I've seen quite a few people come in who are avid golf players, and they'd had to stop playing golf just because they couldn't make it around the course, and now they're back out there playing it. And it's just such a nice thing for them to be able to get their life back, really. So I think this is probably a really good point for us to maybe finish off on. I'll let you give some closing comments on salt therapy. What top tips or things can you share with us to maybe encourage those that haven't delved into halotherapy yet, and to spur on those that are already doing it?
Look, halotherapy, salt therapy, it's not an alternative treatment. It's not something that you want to decide to leave the medical field or whatever you're doing. It's complementary. It helps. Just as an example, as an asthmatic, the airways get inflamed during an asthma attack. It's an instant inflammation. And what a lot of asthmatics find is that, particularly those who infection-based triggers for asthma, the airways are covered with a layer of congestion. So when they take an oral steroid, say for example like a Ventolin, when they take it, they lose most of it in the back of the throat and down into the airways to stimulate the airways to open up. But the problem is that the airways, when they're covered in congestion, the Ventolin, the steroid lands on top of the congestion, eventually to be coughed out and go nowhere. But hold that thought, the side effect usually when you take Ventolin is increased heart rate and increased blood pressure, simply because the steroid is absorbed through the throat and into the bloodstream. That's usually an acceptable side effect for getting relief in your breath. But the problem is that if you've got a layer of congestion blocking and you're not getting the relief, you're just pumping all this steroid in your system. So salt therapy it complements it by breaking up that congestion and allowing that steroid to be far more effective than it was before all that congestion layer. It's the same theory as when most people are probably seen little kids or heard of little kids who have asthma attacks and they don't know how to use Ventolin, or the Ventolin is ineffective. Well, the local GP or the hospital might put them on a nebulizer, and that's just simply Ventolin or steroids mixed with a saline solution and sends a salty mist up, and to break up that congestion so that it can cut through to stimulate the airways to open. Yet there's a lot more salt in that than what we do with the minute particles of salt. So salt therapy is great as a complement to any sort of medication you're taking. So don't think that you're telling people to stop taking medication or it's an alternative. This just complements things. It makes oral medication far more effective. And really, it should be, salt therapy is for everybody. There is nobody that it doesn't help. It helps from people who've got emphysema, who can't breathe, who can't function, who think that they're on their last legs. If they do salt therapy on a regular basis, they'll get a few more legs back. And it's also great for people who are athletes looking for that edge, that aerobic edge. So also we've got all our airways. Let's say the fittest and healthiest of us want to improve their aerobic performance. They just simply have to do salt therapy. It'll break up that congestion. Now, everyone's got congestion. It's part of the cleaning process. But what the salt does is that breaks it all up and allows it to be moved a lot quicker out of the way, so that the conversion of your breath into oxygen into the bloodstream is far more efficient and effective, and increasing that oxygen supply in your blood quite a few percentage points up. So look, salt therapy is for everyone. Make no mistake about it. All right. So it's up to salt therapy centres and salt therapists themselves to go out and spread the good word.
Absolutely. And
I think I went a bit too there.
That's okay. And I think, the name of your salt business says it all. Breathe better. And let's just finish there. But thank you so much, Kenny, for giving us your time and all your knowledge and experience. It's so valuable. I'm guessing that a lot of people are probably thinking, oh my goodness, there's so much information there, I want to watch it again. Well, the good news is that you can watch Kenny again and again and again and again if you want to, by joining the WHA and getting access into the membership area. This video will be housed there hopefully in a couple of weeks for the next 12 months. So come and watch Kenny again and again and again. All right, thanks, Kenny.
My pleasure.
We'll see you again soon.
See you later.